For the past several months, I've been toying with the idea of doing some almost podcast style videos for this channel. The idea behind these videos is that I would take one of my past hikes, one of my past adventures, and take a deep dive into how I was feeling physically and emotionally, talk about what gear worked for me, what gear didn't work for me, and talk a little bit about things I could have done to make these experiences better. It's taken me a bit to figure out which hike to start with. What should episode 1 be? And it just made sense that the first episode should be about my 2013 attempt to thru hike the Tahoe Rim Trail. In 2012, I was working in a little coffee shop here in Reno, and two of my coworkers decided they were going to hike the Tahoe Rim Trail. So I watched as they planned out their trip, planned out their food, planned out, this entire journey. And the idea rooted in my little brain, and I just couldn't shake it. So in 2013, my nephew Josh and I decided we were going to do it too. We were going to hike the Tahoe Rim Trail together. Camping, hiking, and the outdoors had been a part of our lives since we were very, very young. I took my very first camping trip before I could even walk. So we weren't diving into this head first without any experience whatsoever, but neither of us had ever done a multi-night backpacking trip of this magnitude. So that aspect of it was very new to us, and if I'm being honest, we were a little nervous. We planned out the trip in just agonizing detail. How many calories we'd need per day, how many miles we'd have to walk per day to finish within the time frame that we'd allotted for the trip. How much weight to carry, what kind of sleeping bags, and all of the things that go into a backpacking trip. We spent weeks and weeks and weeks planning this all out, making spreadsheets and just really digging in and trying to figure out what we'd need to be successful in this endeavor. We had 15 days, basically, that we could walk the 171-mile loop, and that's plenty of time. Like, most people can really do this trip in about 9 days. We were very, very unexperienced backpackers at the time. The 15-day mark seemed like our safest bet. It seemed like the best chance at success. So we went out, we bought all the gear we would need, we got our shelters and our sleeping bags and brand new backpacks and all this stuff, and we took several practice hikes, just a couple of day hikes and 2 or 3 overnight trips to test out the gear and just make sure we really knew what we were doing, and we weren't setting ourselves up for failure. So the day finally came. My parents dropped us off at the Kingsbury South Trailhead, and we were off and running. The first day was fairly long, but pretty easy hiking. We ended up at Star Lake in the middle of the afternoon. I think it was around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And that wasn't our planned campsite, but it was such an inviting and beautiful little lake. Water everywhere, lots of flat spots for camping. We toyed with the idea of maybe staying there, maybe cutting the miles short and staying next to this gorgeous lake. As we were going through that debate, as we were trying to decide if this was the place we wanted to sleep, it started to rain a little bit. And in my mind, I thought if we moved on a little bit further down the trail, maybe we could beat the storm, or we could get to a spot where the storm wasn't going to get us as badly. And so that's what we decided to do. We decided to push on to our planned camping site, which was in this little saddle just in the shadow of Friel Peak. And as we moved along the trail, the storm clouds kind of got darker and darker and darker. We'd lost daylight much earlier than we had planned on because of the cloud cover. And about a mile after Star Lake, maybe 2 miles, we found this gorgeous little creek and a huge flat area to set up our tents. And looking at the map, we were exactly where we had planned on camping. So I made the decision. I'm like, you know what? Let's set up our tents. Let's camp here. Even if it does rain a little bit, we'll have shelter. Everything's going to be fine. And as we were getting our camp ready, we watched as just the massive granite peak of Friel split this storm in two. And our camp stayed dry for the most part. We got a tiny little sprinkle, but nothing like we would have had if we'd stayed at Star Lake. The next morning, after we'd been on trail for a little while, two of the people that we'd met at Star Lake passed us. They were hiking much, much faster than we were and zipped right by us. And we kind of asked them, oh, how was your night? And they'd had a miserable night. They got absolutely dumped on by rain. So we'd made absolutely the right decision by moving past Star Lake and going to our planned campsite. We were feeling really good, really confident in our decision making at this point. And the second day of the trip, we had planned around being at Round Lake. And I had misread the map, or I had done some bad math, or maybe both. But Round Lake was a much further hike than we thought it was. And we were cruising along, and based on the mileage that we'd covered, we thought we were coming up on Big Meadow. And right as I had said to my nephew, I think we're almost to Big Meadow, we crossed a sign on the trail that said Big Meadow, 9 miles. So we were nowhere close, and we were not going to see Round Lake because Round Lake was another 7, I think, beyond Big Meadow. So the plan changed, and we decided we would camp at this campground right near the Big Meadow trailhead. So we pushed on, and it was a very, very hot day. I remember the heat more than anything, more than the scenery, more than anything. I just remember this oppressive heat. Water was not exactly plentiful, but it wasn't scarce. I mean, we were coming across water sources regularly enough that we were able to stay hydrated, but it was just so hot. And it really beat down on my nephew. He was struggling early on in the day, in the hottest part of the day. He was really struggling. And later in the evening, as we were about 2 or 3 miles from Big Meadow, I started to struggle pretty hard too, and was really looking forward to camp. We made Big Meadow in the early evening. I think it was like 5:30, maybe 6 o'clock. And we set up camp, ate our dinner, and went to bed. In the morning, when we woke up, Josh's zipper on his sleeping bag had broken. We had purchased some pretty cheap sleeping bags, and that was a mistake. So we got a text out to my parents to let them know that along with the food drop they were bringing the following day, Josh would also need a new sleeping bag. And we headed out onto the trail on our way towards Round Lake and ultimately Echo Summit, which is where our food drop was supposed to be. As the day progressed, Josh's attitude and health really started to deteriorate really, really quickly. He was struggling really, really hard. As we came around Showers Lake, there's a big incline with some switchbacks that go through almost chest-high wildflowers. And he was struggling so hard up this hill. He was trying to put on a brave face and making a joke about it, but he was not doing well, and it was really obvious. We got to the top of the switchbacks. We found a nice flat spot. It looked to be probably a dry campsite that somebody had used at some point. And we stopped and we ate some good food and drank our fill of water and kind of talked about, Josh, how are you feeling? What's going on with you? Are you doing okay? And he was not. He was really, really struggling. And in the back of my head, I sort of knew that he might not make the whole trip. As we got nearer to Echo Summit, we were moving very, very slow. And Josh was kind of deteriorating before my eyes. His skin was kind of pale. He was sweating more than he should be. We were hiking through what is largely regarded as one of the most beautiful sections of the Tahoe Rim Trail. And I didn't see any of that. I didn't see any of the scenery. I didn't pay attention to the beauty around me. I was just hyper focused on my nephew's health. He was really, really, really struggling. We got to Echo Summit and set up kind of a stealth camp. There's a dead zone in that area where you're not supposed to camp. And against our better judgment, we decided to camp anyway, just because, I mean, Josh was not doing well. He wasn't going to make the mileage, and he most certainly wasn't going to make any extra mileage. We reached out to my parents, let them know where we were and kind of what was going on, and that Josh wasn't doing well. They drove up and got a hotel room just a few miles down the road, brought us some dinner and some extra water and things like that. And we talked at length about whether Josh should continue. And he decided he wanted to sleep on it. So we climbed into our not so legal stealth campsite and we went to bed. And I did not sleep well that night. I was very, very worried about his health. I kind of knew that the trip was over for him. Whether he had admitted it or not, it seemed like it was pretty much a done deal. I wasn't sure if I was going to carry on alone or not. I just didn't know. So in the morning, my parents came back. They brought us some breakfast and some fresh coffee. And Josh made the decision to go home with them. So we loaded his pack up into their vehicle. I took whatever shared gear that we were carrying and made myself kind of a solo kit. And I decided I was going to push on. My parents weren't super happy with that decision, but what are they going to do? We decided we'd meet at the Echo Summit. There's like a little store in the parking lot there right next to the lake. So I walked the 2 miles. Josh and my parents drove. We got there, we ate breakfast together, and I just pretty firmly decided, this is it. I'm going. I'm doing this by myself. I'm finishing out this hike alone. And off I went into Desolation Wilderness. So the first section that I hiked alone was from Echo Summit into Desolation Wilderness, up past like Aloha Lake and into that area. And I'd kind of thrown the plan out the window at this point. We'd had this paper map that had all the campsites and everything marked down on it, and I bought 2 of them. I left one with my parents with the exact same campsites and everything marked out. But moving alone, I was covering more mileage than I was when we were together. It was easier for me to move a little bit faster. I got to Aloha Lake and it was very crowded. Lots of hikers, lots of campers, lots of day hikers, just people everywhere. And I really felt like I needed a little bit more solitude. It was my first night alone on trail and I just didn't want to be surrounded by strangers. So I pushed on over Mosquito Pass, down past Heather Lake, and down to Susie Lake, which to this day is one of my favorite places in Desolation Wilderness. It's this gorgeous little alpine lake surrounded by tall pine trees. There's this lush red soil everywhere you look, and I found just the perfect little campsite. Just far enough away from the water, just far enough away from the trail. It was absolutely perfect. And settled in for the night, really had an enjoyable first night alone, and I think slept better than I had any other night that trip so far. In the morning, I woke up really early, got my stuff together, got my breakfast down, and started heading out down the trail again. And the plan, according to the map, was to camp near Phipps Creek, about, I think, 10 or 12 miles from where I was at Susie Lake. Pushed through, hiked along, was covering the mileage really well, was moving really well, felt very comfortable on trail. I got to Phipps Creek and it was bone dry. No water anywhere in sight. So pulled out my map, started to look around to see where else I could camp. And as I sat there, 2 other thru hikers came along coming the other direction. It being a loop, some folks go clockwise, some folks go counterclockwise, and I was going clockwise. So these kids came in the other direction, and I kind of grilled them for information. I was just like, hey, where's the next water source? And it turned out that Lake Richardson was the next reliable water source. So I had roughly 7 more miles to go for the night. And some of those miles were the miles that I should have been walking the following day leading up to my next food drop. My wife was going to meet me up at Barker Pass with my next food drop and some clean clothes and good stuff like that. So I decided, if I cover the extra mileage tonight, which would put me at my longest day hiking ever, I would have been at 17 miles, which would have, for me at the time in 2013, would have been the longest I've ever hiked. And I decided, you know what, I'm going to push through, I'm going to walk the 17 miles, and then I'm just going to hang out and relax at Richardson Lake. Maybe I'll take a swim. Maybe I'll, clean up some of my camping gear that's been laying in the dirt for the last 3 or 4 days, and just have a relaxing day. Like maybe like a half a day off, basically. So that's exactly what I did, and it was glorious. Got up in the morning, and I was sitting there cooking my breakfast. I'll never forget this. Sitting there cooking my breakfast, and I got this kind of feeling. Sometimes you get that feeling on the trail that somebody's watching you. There are eyes on you. And I looked behind me, and from the Tahoe Rim Trail, the proper actual trail, there was a lone coyote staring down at me at the lake shore. And we met eyes for a minute, and the coyote bolted off into the wilderness. But it's an experience I won't soon forget. It was pretty special. I worked my way up to Barker Pass. I left Richardson probably about noon and worked my way up to Barker Pass to meet my wife, and she wasn't there. So pulled out my book, sat down in the grass in the little meadow there and started to read, and about an hour went by, and finally I hear an engine coming up the road and see my wife's car. She opens the door, and she'd brought my dog, which was so cool. So it was really nice to sit there and wrestle with my dog in the grass. My wife brought this glorious dinner, tons of really great home-cooked food, and we took a much longer break than I intended. She ended up leaving Barker Pass at around 7:30, and it was a little too late for me to carry on down the trail, even though I probably only had 2 or 3 miles to the next water source and the next campsite. So I decided to, once again, stealth camp at the trailhead, which, not best practice. I'm going to be real honest. But at the time, it seemed like a good decision. In the morning, I got up early, used the indoor pit toilet, which anybody who's done a thru hike can tell you how epic of a feeling that is, to be able to go to the bathroom inside when you're on a long trail like that. And off I went down the trail. The plan for this day was to camp at Ward Creek, and it was an ambitious one. It was a lot of mileage and a lot of, up and down and up and down, some big exposed sections over this kind of rough granity area where there's no trees. And I was moving really well. I was feeling really good, and I made it into Ward Creek. And as I started coming down the trail and started looking for a place to camp, there were signs all over the place asking people not to camp there because they were doing wildlife rehabilitation. I'm certain, looking back on it, that I could have camped there, but it just didn't sit right with me. I didn't want to be that guy. So I decided to move on. Little did I know, there wasn't really any good camping past Ward Creek. Once you got past the creek, you're into this kind of logging area, and you're walking on just a dirt road, basically, just this logging road, fire road kind of a thing. And the next stop is Tahoe City. Now, there's a campground in Tahoe City, and so my plan became to get a spot in this campground, take a day off the next day, and just hang out on the shores of Lake Tahoe, take a swim, just relax and enjoy myself, and really prepare myself for the mileage ahead. The next section of trail leaving Tahoe City is very, very dry, so it was going to be a long water carry, and I thought it'd be great just to take a whole day off, rest, relax, and tackle this uphill section, this uphill water carry on a completely fresh body. When I got to the campground in Tahoe City, it was completely full. There were no available spaces. I kind of rolled the dice a little bit and I walked through the campground talking to a handful of the campers and just asked, hey, is it okay if I borrow a little corner of your campsite? Can I just borrow this little piece and I won't bother you? I'll just stay over here. And everybody said no, which is to be expected, I guess. People on vacation don't want some dirty bearded stranger occupying space in their campsite, but it was worth the effort. So I loaded up on water and started my way uphill on this long, dry section. I figured I'd walk a mile or two, I'd find a good place to camp, and all would be right with my world. 8 miles later, I finally found a workable campsite. It was well after dark. I was just beaten down, completely ragged. I very quickly boiled up some beans and rice and just went to bed. I was completely done. In my haste to get to bed, I neglected to plug my cell phone into the little portable battery that I was carrying. And that would become a big issue very, very quickly. Coming through Ward Creek earlier in that day, I had rolled my ankle a little bit. It didn't hurt. It didn't feel bad at all. So I just kind of ignored it and walked on. And the rest of the day, it didn't hurt. It was fine. Crawling uphill with all the extra water I was carrying, it was fine. I woke up in the morning and it was not fine. It had swollen up pretty significantly in the night and it was hurting pretty bad. Just putting weight on it felt pretty bad. I thought that I could walk it off. It didn't seem that serious of an injury to me at the moment. So I decided instead of walking back into Tahoe City and making that dreaded phone call to have somebody come pick me up, I would carry on towards Watson Lake, which was my next planned campsite. And as I worked my way up towards Watson Lake, the pain got much, much worse. And it had kind of gone from manageable to not very, very quickly. And I was far enough up the trail that it was closer to get to Watson Lake than it was to go back to Tahoe City. I knew there was a dirt road that drove up to Watson Lake because I'd been there before. So I figured I'll get to Watson Lake, I'll send a message and have somebody come pick me up at the lake. I get to the lake and I had like 6% battery left on my cell phone. So I sent the text, at Watson Lake, injured, come get me, and my phone died. I don't know if the text message gone through. I don't know if anyone's coming. I do know from looking at this road that I had driven up previously that the weather had not been kind to it. It was all rutted out and just gnarled up. You would need a pretty serious four-wheel drive vehicle to make it up this road, and no one in my life at the time had one of those. So I made the decision to hike an additional 2 miles on this injured ankle down to a paved road that connected to the highway. And I thought, it'd be much easier to find me here. They'd have to come up this paved road to find the dirt road anyway. Worked my way all the way down. By this time, I only had about half a liter of water left. But I assumed someone was coming. I sat next to this little paved road for about 2 hours. And no one came. No cars at all drove up this road. I was dangerously low on water, and walking all the way back up to Watson was out of the question with the way my ankle was feeling. So I pulled out my map and did some calculations, and it looked to be 2.5, maybe 3 miles to the actual highway. So I thought, I'll limp my way down to the highway, I'll hitchhike into town, I'll find a payphone, I will make a call and make sure someone's coming to get me. I packed up all my stuff again, drank the last little swig of water that I had, and started down the trail. I hadn't gone 10 steps before a Forest Service fire rescue truck pulled up and asked me if I was doing okay. And I told him I wasn't, and told him everything that was going on. And it turns out they were not there looking for me. They were out on a training operation and just happened across me. So they had me sit down, they iced my ankle, they gave me some Gatorade, and as they were sitting there, taking care of me, my parents pulled up. And they didn't see me. I was sitting on the ground kind of behind the fire truck, and I can hear kind of the panic in my mom's voice asking the firefighter, this EMT guy, if they'd seen a hiker that matched my description. And he's like, oh yeah, he's right here. We're with him. So they loaded my gear up into the car. They loaded me up into the car, and I was on my way home. I'd made it about halfway around the Tahoe Rim Trail, and most of that solo. Looking back on it now, it's hard. It's hard to tell this story. It's hard to admit defeat. But in the long run, I learned a lot. Primarily, I learned that cheap gear gives you exactly what you've paid for. We went pretty cheap on our shelters and our sleep systems for this trip, and paid the price. I'm a firm believer that you don't have to spend a ton of money on gear. You don't have to have the most expensive thing. You don't have to have the best brand name or anything like that, but your gear does need to meet some certain criteria. It needs to keep you comfortable, both on and off trail, and it needs to keep you safe. Now, carrying stuff that's way, way too heavy and that's not designed for backpacking is going to make you uncomfortable on trail. And I learned that the hard way. And it's not necessarily going to keep you safe either, because it's not really designed to do the things that you're asking of it. And I think in the end, that was probably one of my most valuable lessons on this trail. The other thing that I learned is that failure isn't the end. And ultimately, I don't feel like I failed. I just didn't finish the trail. I successfully walked 17 miles in one day, which at the time was a huge deal for me. I successfully slept alone 3 nights in the wilderness, which at the time was a brand new thing for me. So there were a lot of wins from this trip, even though I didn't actually finish. And honestly, the trail's not going anywhere. I can always try again. Well, that is it for the first of these podcast-style episodes. Let me know down in the comments if you enjoyed this format, if this is something you'd like to see me explore more in the future. Obviously, I have a ton of other adventures that we could dig into and talk about. I certainly enjoyed making it. I hope you've enjoyed watching it. And as always, we will talk again soon.